Recall your study of ancient China. It was a vast territory, and one emperor is supposed to control all of it. He's supposed to collect taxes from the nether regions. He's supposed to regulate the whole country. Of course, he couldn't do it alone. He needed people to work under him, to work for him. And this is how the Chinese bureaucracy was created. Now in the United States, we do not have a centralized government solely. Of course, we have federalism. So you would think that to some extent, having this system of states and local governments in addition to the national government, there would be less of a need for a federal bureaucracy. But we do still have a president and Congress who have a desire to influence the country in its entirety, and it is a big country, and so we'll still need a bureaucracy. And the past 100 years or so, as we've seen the size of the central government, the federal government, grow so extensively, we see just as much the growth of the bureaucracy to the point now where it's actually called the fourth branch of government. Nothing in the U.S. Constitution explicitly establishes a bureaucracy, but because Congress and the President create laws that they need executed and the President can't execute them. More recently, there's been some controversy, which is whether the fourth branch of the government, the bureaucracy, is acting without checks and balances when they create regulations. Now, of course, when Congress creates laws which govern us, there has to be a check by the other house of Congress and by the President and then by the courts. Well, what kind of checks are there when the regulations are created by the bureaucratic organizations? Aren't they just like laws because they tell us what to do and fine us or punish us if we break those regulations? And I guess the only response to that would be that the courts are still established, as we will see in just a moment, to ultimately serve as a check on the power of these bureaucratic organizations. So in Idaho, there's this couple, the Sacketts, and the Sacketts bought some land here next to a lake, and they wanted to build a house. They started to clear the land for building a house, and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, came and said, "Stop! You are building according to our maps on a wetland, a declared federal wetland, and as such, you're breaking the law, and you're facing now up to $75,000 in fines per day that you don't spend restoring this to the wetland that it once was." Sackett said, "You're insane. There's no wetland here. We're next to a lake. This is just property. There's houses all around us. How can this be a wetland?" EPA says, "Look, according to our records and the GPS that we're looking at on our screen here at the EPA headquarters, that is a wetland, and therefore we are suing you." Now, this went all the way to the Supreme Court. 9-0, the Supreme Court decided, look, EPA, you're out of bounds, and you need to stop all your foolishness and let the Sacketts build on their property. So here we can see that, in fact, there is a check on the power of the bureaucracy, which is the courts. Let's take a look at bureaucrats themselves and how they get their job. We remember in China that there was an exam system, and you had to pass this Confucian exam in order to become a bureaucrat. And of course, laws were kind of broken there, where occasionally it was who you knew, not what you knew, that got you the job. Unfortunately, in our history, we see that there's some history of this as well. We call this the spoil system. To the victors go the spoils. The victors being presidents or other elected officials. Because they're elected, now they get to give back to the people that supported their campaigns. And so if I give to the Obama administration, maybe Obama will say, "Hey, Mr. Fry, how'd you like to be ambassador to some country in the West Indies?" And I'll be like, "That's sweet. I want to sit on an island and have a job there." So that's kind of the deal. Now, this went as far as 1881, where Charles Guiteau was frustrated that he wouldn't get a job from President Garfield after he donated to his campaign. And I think you remember how that situation ended up. Janie got a gun. It wasn't Janie, but it was Guiteau. He shot President Garfield. President Garfield died. And so, of course, his successor, Vice President Arthur, becomes president and says, "Look, we got to put a stop to all this madness." So they created the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which essentially declares that you can't get a job in the government just because you know somebody.
They say when Jamie was arrested, they found him underneath the train. But man, he had it coming. Now that Jamie's got a gun, she ain't never gonna be the same.
Later we see legislation that makes it more difficult for bureaucratic organizations to politic. In other words, they don't want too much of a connection to the people that hire them, so you shouldn't be able to get them elected directly. Now we still have indirect election support via unions, so particularly with the states, we see like the SCIU, the CTA, they have quite a bit of money and power, and they're able to use that to get folks elected. We should point out that public employee unions, they haven't always existed, and there are folks who believe that while private unions are certainly necessary and important, that public employee unions are not so much. One particular individual that is often quoted by conservatives is FDR. Yes, I just said FDR is often quoted by conservatives, at least in this way. So here's what he says about the reasons why we shouldn't necessarily have public employee unions. So what's FDR's criticism of public employee unions? Isn't he basically saying that the problem is that the government has unlimited resources as long as they can continue to raise taxes, increase revenues, to have money to pay the public employee unions, then they're going to be able to do so. Unlike private employee unions, who only have so much to give. Let's take two examples, starting with the private employee unions. Remember Hostess, the bakery? They recently had an issue where the workers, the labor union there, wanted more money, more pay, and the company said, look, we don't have any more to give you. Well, ultimately, since the union there held out and they said, well, we're not going to stop striking until you give us more, what did Hostess do? They filed for bankruptcy. They went under. Those people don't have jobs anymore. Okay, ultimately the boss here of Hostess said, look, I don't have any more money to give you, and so that is the limit to the negotiations. Those limits are usually good things. The employee union for Hostess, they're idiots. If they were smart, they would have seen that there was really no higher that the boss could go and said, well, I think I'd rather keep my job, instead of basically now having to look for another Twinkie making job, probably down in Mexico. Now let's take another example, this time a public employee union. How about the California prison workers, the correctional officers? Let's say that they as a union strike because they want higher wages. Now the government can say we don't have any more money, but the union can say in return, you can get more money because you can raise taxes, you can increase your revenues, or you can cut spending somewhere else. You're not a company that only has so much money. There are unlimited amount of resources for you to draw from. Furthermore, since we, the employee union, helped you guys get elected, many of you in office, we are going to expect you to raise taxes or do what you have to do to pay us more, or we are not going to support your campaigns in the future. These two factors give public employee unions an immense amount of power. Let's expand our thoughts here now to the bureaucracy as a whole. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, do we have an efficient bureaucracy, particularly when we have $16 trillion in debt? Is this the type of thing we should be looking at cutting down on? Has the government itself, particularly with the bureaucratic organizations, grown too large? One way to evaluate this is to look at overlapping powers. Do we see that there's multiple organizations that all have been created with seemingly the same function as another? And so we can certainly look at how the bureaucratic organization is structured to see if we do have overlapping. If you were starting a new country, you would probably get an engineer and say, hey engineer, I want to design a very efficient bureaucracy and it needs to all work together in sync and no overlapping needs to occur. You'd probably have something that looks like the grid here of Paris, very designed, very perfect, works together very well. But our founding fathers didn't sit down with an engineer. In fact, the bureaucracy wasn't planned all at once. It was added upon year after year as new agencies were added to the pile of bureaucratic organizations, to where now we have kind of a mess that looks something like Atlanta. Let me give you an example. We have 12 agencies in America that regulate our food supply. Examples would include the FDA, who are in charge of regulating eggs when they're still in the shell. Once those eggs are cracked and processed, though, there's another group, the USDA, that takes over. The FDA is in charge of cheese pizza, but because there is meat used in pepperoni, the USDA has charge over that. I'm not kidding. Now, the more of these overlapping jurisdictions that we have, the more money we're wasting. So the question is, can we start over? Can we just get rid of all the bureaucratic organizations and kind of design it with an engineer like Paris? So lastly, let's have a look at a few different types of organizations of the bureaucracy, starting with cabinets. Cabinets work most closely and directly with the president. The secretary of each department is chosen by the president, and he can actually replace them as he wants. He doesn't usually say you're fired. He usually says, hey, why don't you resign because you want to spend more time with your family. We all know what that means typically. And here's Obama's cabinet. Name some of these VIPs. Other organizations include independent regulatory commissions. These ones are more annoying because they typically make very specific guidelines and restrictions, and they make businesses kind of grumpy because they have to comply with all these restrictions and guidelines. You might have heard of some of these, including the Federal Communications Commission or the Federal Trade Commission or the SEC. The SEC are supposed to be regulating securities and exchanges. And I know what you're thinking, Mr. Fry, where were they and what were they doing in 2008 when we had the financial collapse because of all these securities that were exchanged without really any limits? The answer may shock you. Ask Mr. Fry in class. There are certain things for which the government feels they're so important that they can't leave them to the private sector. And one of those things would be mail delivery. They think that it's so important that for business and such, interstate commerce, that things get mailed on time and effectively and efficiently, that there should be some type of government corporation to handle that. And this is an example of where we have something that could be handled by the private sector, UPS, FedEx, but the government feels that there is that overriding need for a government corporation. Ground control to Major Tom. The last group of organizations are independent executive agencies established by the president, and they have a lot less to do with the country as a whole in terms of governing, and they have a lot more to do with specific policy areas such as aerospace. If a president, Kennedy, feels that it's important for us to go into outer space and spend lots of money doing it, then they establish NASA. They tell Congress to give them a bunch of money, and they let them work on going to outer space. Same thing with the National Science Foundation. They feel there's a need to get more scientific type of jobs so that we can compete with other countries like China and India. Well, then put some money into the sciences, hope that you have better schools, and in turn, better scientists that can compete in the world. So in conclusion, there's a whole lot of people that are helping the president and Congress to execute the laws that they make, even in creating more further laws and regulations. And we can ask ourselves these questions such as, has it grown too large? We'll examine that in a Socratic seminar in class. And are there enough checks and balances on the regulatory agencies specifically? And then lastly, we can evaluate whether or not certain things like NASA and the Science Foundation need to be funded by the government at all, or if there can be just as easily an organization privately funded that can do the same work.